Trump now says tariffs didn't just change trade, they settled 8 wars, including a claimed threat of 350% duties on both India and Pakistan to stop them from fighting. At the same time, roughly half of those same tariffs are under Supreme Court review, with multiple lower courts calling them illegal uses of emergency power, and experts warning that a ruling against him could instantly cut effective tariff rates in half. When a president credits tariffs with stopping wars and a court considers striking them down, you're not just watching trade policy. You're watching a fight over who controls the economic weapons of a superpower. From an investor's perspective, the story Trump just told is extraordinary. In recent remarks, he claimed that of the 8 wars I ended, 5 or 6 were because of tariffs, and repeated his longer-running boast that he personally prevented an India-Pakistan conflict by threatening both nuclear-armed neighbors with massive tariffs unless they backed down. Indian media report he has said he warned of 100%, 150%, 200%, and even 350% tariffs, and that within 24 hours the crisis eased. U.S. Senator Marco Rubio has even suggested Trump deserves more credit for very dangerous peace deals, including India-Pakistan, because he leveraged trade instead of troops. India's government, however, firmly disputes the idea that it caved to tariff threats, with External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar stressing that New Delhi did not accept such pressure and that India responded to intelligence about Pakistan on its own terms. The broader 8 wars claim is equally vague and contested. Trump has not published a clear list of which 8 conflicts he believes he resolved, though he has previously pointed to tensions in the Middle East, the Korean Peninsula, and South Asia. Analysts quoted in coverage describe his narrative as exaggerated and lacking long-term evidence that the underlying disputes were actually settled rather than temporarily cooled. They note that while economic pressure can help push warring parties toward ceasefires, trade tools alone rarely address the underlying causes, and many of the conflicts he references have since flared again or remain fragile. Still, the idea is powerful politically. Tariffs as an alternative to war, dollars as bullets, sanctions and duties as the new deterrent. It lets him recast controversial levies not as taxes on consumers, but as peacekeeping devices. Now place that narrative next to the Supreme Court timeline. A series of lawsuits has challenged Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, EPA, to impose broad, reciprocal, and deficit-driven tariffs on a wide range of partners, including China, Mexico, Canada, Brazil, India, and others. Under the Constitution, Congress controls taxation and tariffs, but it can delegate limited authority to the president under defined conditions. Past presidents used national security statutes for narrow sectoral tariffs, steel, aluminum, specific defense-related imports. Trump went further, invoking IEEPA to declare trade deficits and fentanyl flows national emergencies, and then layering wide-ranging tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of imports. 3 lower courts have already said this, stretched the law too far, finding the emergency rationale pretextual and the delegation too broad. The Supreme Court is now expected to rule soon on the legality of roughly half of Trump's current tariffs, specifically those built on IEEPA. If the justices uphold them, it effectively blesses a model in which presidents can use emergency powers to unilaterally ratchet tariffs up or down, unconstrained by geography, sector, or rate ceilings, so long as they can tie the move to some external threat. If they strike them down, the average effective tariff rate facing us importers could be roughly halved overnight, with major consequences for trade flows, prices, and corporate strategies that assumed the new regime would endure. In the short run, invalidation would create legal and commercial turmoil. Companies would rush to claim refunds. Contracts would need to be renegotiated, and some reshoring decisions might be revisited. In the longer run, it would push Congress to either legislate a clearer tariff framework or accept a reversion toward lower baselines. Against that backdrop, Trump's 8 wars line becomes more than a brag. It's a political shield. If tariffs are portrayed as having prevented a nuclear conflict between India and Pakistan and contributed to multiple ceasefires, striking them down can be framed as weakening national security, even if the court is formally ruling only on whether IEEPA was used lawfully. Expect to hear the argument that judges in Washington are taking away tools that kept peace abroad and shrank the trade deficit at home. Official data show the U.S. trade gap did narrow to its lowest level since 2020 after recent tariff hikes, with imports slowing and exports rising in key categories. Analysts caution that this adjustment is far from a miracle. Imports fell in part because tariffs choked demand, and there is limited evidence of a large-scale substitution into domestic production. But for a political narrative, tariffs close the trade gap and stopped wars is catchy. The India angle gives you a powerful hook for your audience. Indian outlets highlight Trump's repeated claims that he settled a May standoff by threatening both New Delhi and Islamabad with triple-digit tariffs, while Indian officials insist they made decisions based on intelligence and national interest, not foreign economic pressure. That tension lets you ask, how much leverage does the U.S. actually have over big emerging economies like India via tariffs? And how much of this is post-TFAC storytelling? At the same time, Indian business media warn that the Supreme Court's tariff verdict could reshape India's trade talks and affect access to the U.S. market for Indian exporters in sectors from it to textiles and pharma. If the court cuts back Trump's unilateral tariff power, India may see more stability and fewer sudden tariff shocks. If it upholds them, Indian firms must plan for a world where one U.S. signature can radically change their cost structure. For a Buffett-style investor, tariffs are never just about geopolitics or legal doctrine. They are about cash flows, moats, and optionality. The data so far suggests that reciprocal tariffs have pushed some reshoring and boosted demand for US-made products in select industries as companies adjust sourcing and invest in automation. But they've also raised average tariff rates to levels not seen since the 1930s, increased input costs, and injected uncertainty into long supply chains. If the Supreme Court validates this framework, CEOs and investors must assume that any future president, not just Trump, can and will use emergency authority to weaponize tariffs quickly across many sectors for reasons ranging from drugs to digital data. That means political risk becomes a permanent line item in any global sourcing decision. If the court strikes it down, there will be short, sharp disruption, but also a chance to rebuild trade rules on firmer, more predictable statutory ground. Either way, the smart money avoids getting trapped in the middle. Businesses whose margins only work under one specific tariff configuration are speculations, not investments. Firms that can profit under both high tariff and lower tariff regimes because they have diversified supply, strong brands, pricing power, or proprietary technology will weather the legal swing better. Meanwhile, sectors most exposed to geopolitical shocks, defense, critical minerals, semiconductors, agribusiness, will continue to attract both tariffs and subsidies, and thus sit closer to political fault lines. For them, Trump's claim that tariffs can stop wars is less important than whether the rules of the game will be written in courts and laws or on social media. At a deeper level, what you are watching is a struggle over how America projects power. One vision says use tariffs, sanctions, and trade threats to coerce adversaries and even allies, keeping troops at home and war short. Another says that kind of economic war, when unconstrained, erodes alliances, distorts markets, and undermines the constitutional balance between Congress and the presidency. The Supreme Court cannot decide which grand strategy is right, but it can decide whether emergency tariff weapons must be clearly authorized by elected legislators rather than improvised by the executive. Trump's 8 wars story is his way of putting moral pressure on the justices if they rule against him. They're not just correcting a legal overreach. They're, in his framing, taking away the tools that kept nuclear powers apart. For viewers trying to make sense of all this, the key is to separate 3 questions. Did tariffs actually settle 8 wars, or did they play a supporting role in a few tense episodes? Were Trump's IEEPA tariffs within the legal bounds Congress intended, or did they stretch emergency powers too far? And regardless of the court's answer, how should countries like India and investors everywhere position themselves in a world where trade can be turned into a weapon with little warning? Those are the questions that matter more than any single boast. The court's ruling will tell you how much of Trump's tariff arsenal survives. Markets will tell you what they think of that verdict. History will be slower to judge whether tariffs stop more wars than they started.